Okay, I think we are live. Good evening, everybody. My name's Luke Turner. I'm hosting this discussion for Unsound this evening under the title, Nature is Healing, ? Importantly, our relationship with the non-human under COVID-19. Now, this panel is somewhat inspired by an essay I've written for the Unsound book this year, which it's sort of all about how under the first days of lockdown in London, people were getting very excited about on the internet and sharing memes and so on, about how nature in some way was healing because of the coronavirus. There was some dubious Extinction Rebellion flyers, which Extinction Rebellion claimed were not their own flyers, but were distributed by infiltrators from the far right, saying that humanity was a virus and the coronavirus was the cure. And these sorts of things were making me feel very anxious about, people taking this situation in the wrong way. And it also connected to a lot of what I've been thinking about over recent years in terms of what is nature and how we respond to nature and how we are part of nature as humans, and are we really that different from the non-human? I wrote a book called Out of the Woods, which is a memoir that explores our relationship with forests and tries to bring some sort of non-heterosexual sexuality into discussion around nature and art. And I think sort of studying this in sort of a lot of depth over the past few years made this summer feel quite acute, particularly it was a very hot summer in the UK, spring in the UK. It felt like you were really getting the effects of climate change becoming more and more evident. And I thought it would be good to bring us to Unsound and sort of have a discussion with some people who engage with ecology, creativity, and who sort of has ownership over place in their work. So the three guests we have tonight are Lars Holdhus, who you might know best as TCF, Norwegian-born artist and musician. JT Roane, who leads the Black Ecologies Initiative at Arizona State University, and Jessica Lee, a writer and editor of the Willowherb Review, a fantastic literary journal dedicated to nature writing by people of colour. So what I'm keen to do is sort of start off with asking everybody to give a little bit more background about what they do and why they sort of felt a sort of need to engage with what they do in their work. Jessica, Willowherb's been going for a few years now. Can you tell us a bit about why you set it up and what your sort of mission is?
Yeah, I set up the Willowherb Review in 2018, so it's just 2 years now. Essentially, sort of after my first couple of years in, I guess what you could say, in my career as a nature writer, I come from a mixed race background, and in the first couple of years that I was out, doing book tour, doing book events, really thinking about the genre of nature writing and about the natural world, I just didn't really feel like there was a lot of community when it came to people like me, people who had more complicated origin stories, perhaps, and people of color. I didn't see a lot of representation. I wasn't convinced that was because the writers didn't exist. I was really convinced that there was a structural problem. So yeah, I started the journal, which is a really simple online platform just to put money in the hands of writers to commission them to do this work. And since then, we've published almost 30 writers now, I think, in the past 2 years. We've had 3 issues and 1 special issue, which actually was done with you as well, Luke. And it's been really extraordinary to see community grow up and to really have a sense that, when people say, oh, are there people of color doing nature writing? Are there these voices when it comes to nature and environment? Like, the answer is very straightforward. Like, yes, and there are loads, so you just need to start reading them at this point.
Yeah, it's been really exciting just to see the sort of explosion of talent that, what was the explosion, because it was already there. It's just you've brought it to the surface, which has been great to see, because I think there can be that people have that attitude sometimes, which is like, oh, nature, particularly in the UK, I'm talking about nature stuff. This is like white people like, lol, which I always found was like kind of really unhelpful and probably, not reflective of people's actual attitudes to to what was happening. It's just about creating a space for people to be able to let their voices speak.
Yeah, and to not be prescriptive about what that engagement might look like, to not assume that like going out for a walk in nature needs to look a particular way, that, you know, everyone's going to engage with the natural environment in their cities, in their parks, in the countryside in the same way, and that there's not really a one size fits all solution for that. And so I wanted to create a space that would allow all of that to exist at once. And it's, I mean, there are a lot of spaces that I think are really doing this work right now and generating change. So I feel like we're caught a bit in like a great moment in the tide, I think, in terms of seeing change. But yeah, it's you know, I think the big thing is about not being prescriptive about what that looks like to engage with the natural world.
Yeah, great. And JT, I think I encountered your work via Twitter and a piece that I wanted to talk about a bit later on about the Tidewater Virginia. Can you tell us what your work at the university, what sort of, for people who don't know, simply kind of what is Black Ecologies, just to kind of explain it to people who might not know what it is?
Yeah, well, Black Ecologies, Justin Holsby and I, who's on the faculty at Emory in anthropology, we started writing almost a couple of years ago now, about Black ecologies, and really trying to change the conversation about how we think about the environment in relation to academic writing and thought, but also in relation to the sort of wider eddies that makes in the world. So for us, Black Ecologies is really, it names a kind of double function, serves a kind of double function in its naming. First of all, to highlight and underscore Black diasporic vulnerability, right? In many ways, Black communities globally continue to both experience the worst effects of extractivism, and also experience dumping and other kinds of modes that really most directly impact the health and well-being of those communities. In addition to that, of course, are the effects of climate change. And as Justin's work around Katrina lays bare, you know, that was years of systematic vulnerability piled into one sort of climatic event. And we want to emphasize that, but we also want to emphasize Black ecologies as alternative epistemologies, as alternative frameworks and knowledges, as alternative histories that underscore the ways that Black communities theorize, practice, engage in creative solutions towards alternatives that we think should have some bearing on the post-oil future. And I think, and that's kind of what the initiative picks up on at ASU. We're really trying to, I'm trying to, you know, create cultural resources that draw on and engage Black expressive and vernacular modalities and other, as well as, you know, intellectual histories that really that emphasize these 2 points. And I think also, and then I'll hush, I think, actually, I'll just hush.
That's great. That's great. So are there quite a few of you working on it together? And are you mainly all in the university, or do you sort of then have outreach into the community too?
We do, Justin and I both, we kind of move together in this work, have been moving together in this work. We've drawn in some of our other colleagues who are working on very similar phenomenon in different places. So Hilda Llorens, for example, who's working on Puerto Rico and energy and kind of violent extractionism and all of that in that context, and also Black possibilities for alternative infrastructures and means. And then also Justin and I have been working with People Strike. So People Strike comes out of a call by Cooperation Jackson for a general strike, and it kind of has evolved to figure out what organizing and supporting that would look like. As part of the environmental committee, we've been in a deep listening, talking to folks who are thinking about these matters and concerns in different contexts, and trying to think about how we can create resources that foster two primary points that we focus on, which are, carbon cessation in terms of fossil fuel production and use, and also food sovereignty. So that's, we try to navigate both sides, both the sort of political terrain and the academic space.
Fantastic, thank you. And Lars, how did your sort of interest in ecology connect to your music? Is it something that's evolved from music, and how did it shape it? And you now do this newsletter, Biota, people can sign up to. How did all that sort of intertwine and take shape?
I mean, over the years, I started to study mostly on my spare time next to doing music and art. I started to study sort of regenerative agriculture and permaculture, and sort of like all of the different aspects of that. And out of that came sort of a need to also change my own life. And then from that need came the need to sort of like spread the knowledge that I've sort of gathered. So I started a newsletter that is sort of like open for everyone just to sign up. And it's been a bit irregular, but like we meet up with different festivals and so on to do newsletters for them, and done newsletters sort of irregularly for like a year plus, almost 2 years. And we keep coming back to this idea of sort of like more of an entry for people into this than very advanced and very practical. I'm very much about sort of the practicality of things, and sort of trying to figure out where people can start entering into more sustainable life in general. And this requires everything from sort of how you go about music, or how you go about, in general, everything in life we try to sort of cover. So that's sort of where I find myself now. And also trying to, I mean, as a living in an oil country, heavily funded by that, I sort of try to minimize my impact in general.
Because there's a lot of oil money in music in Scandinavia, isn't there? And sort of funding various festivals and stuff I've sort of noticed over the years, but particularly in Norway.
Yeah, there's some of that, but it also got some serious backlash, and people complained about it. So they sort of like got a bit out of that. But of course, I mean, like with the nation heavily involved in fossil fuels, you're not gonna get away from it if you live here. It's just almost impossible. You have to sort of free yourself as much as you can from the things that will require you to take that money. And of course, cultural section is like an area where they can fund easily. And I mean, but it's definitely had a serious backlash, luckily.
So I wanted to ask, I don't know who wants to go first, but sort of if this time of coronavirus has changed your experience of the non-human world. For instance, in London, I've seen so many more birds of prey everywhere, sparrowhawks, buzzards, I think a hobby. And, people were saying, it's because of COVID, the air is cleaner. And I think this is nonsense. I've just been around my back garden a lot more, not going out. So I've been more observant. I've had an engagement in a different way because of that. I wanted to ask if you'd had any of these sorts of experiences yourselves. Had you seen things change? Had you had a different, had you found green space helpful to sort of deal with the psychological pressures of what's been going on? I don't know who goes first. Jessica, do you want to?
I can jump in. Yeah. So I just moved back to London from Berlin last week, and I was in Berlin up until then. And I mean, we had this sort of strange experience of not being restricted in terms of where we could go. It was like I could still get on my bike or get on the train and go out into the countryside if I wanted to, and that was not a problem. But we didn't, like, for the first few months especially, my husband and I were very strict, and we stayed home and didn't really leave our sort of square mile in our block, like supermarket and home and nowhere else. And I noticed that as someone who, you know, my entire career has been based on spending time in nature and observing and documenting, either as an environmental historian or as a nature writer, that's what I do. I realized that I had never actually noticed even what the trees were outside my bedroom window, which is really bizarre. I was living in a flat, and it was just like suddenly, you know, I wasn't in this position where I was, you know, going far away to go do a trek to write about it, which is my job. I was instead staying home and looking out my window and writing about that. And it was really shocking to me because I realized there was what I had thought was one big tree outside my bedroom window. It was actually two. And it's so minor, but it's like, how did I not notice that after years of living there? So it really cultivated, I think, a closeness and an attention to a bit that I probably had neglected, which in hindsight, now that I've moved away, I'm really grateful for, because it meant I really got to connect to that place much more deeply before leaving.
That's great. How about you, JT? Have you noticed anything different?
So I've been across these really different landscapes in the last few months that make it hard for me to sort of definitively answer that. Like, I've been in the desert up through June. I was in the desert, then I was in the Tidewater, Virginia, and now I'm in New York City for a year for a fellowship. So I'm like, so part of it is like just the kind of motion through those spaces and thinking about Corona and the kinds of worlds that it forecloses all around, I guess, particularly in terms of human to human connection. I think for me, the environment is always about human relationships, and what we're discussing quite often is like ourselves. And not to determine that, but just to say that that I found myself looking, especially in Virginia, in a way at the kind of ongoing and enduring histories of factors that bring stuff like Corona to the fore, deforestation. I mean, I found myself looking more, I guess I grew up and left home in Virginia with a sense of it as a kind of pristine environment, like not really as a child and as a young person, not cognizant of like what it means that fields are sites of abstraction and extraction, what it means that that even forests in that part of Virginia, which are constantly cut and regrown century after century, that those are not, there's nothing natural about that landscape at all. And I think that's been more, as there's a pressure to kind of develop in that section of the state, I see that more and more, and I feel like I had a lot of animal encounters this summer, but I took them as a sign of we not doing so good. I saw a few snakes, animals that don't enjoy direct in a relationship with humans all that well, right? Ones that societally and culturally people are afraid of, and all of that. Mainly because they've been elusive, but now they're everywhere because of developmental pressures in these rural spaces. I think that's been more my encounter. And especially when we think about coronavirus, I mean, you know, the sort of foolishness of a certain government passing along the ongoing understanding that it came from anything more than deforestation and industrial farming. You know, we see what these new kinds of connections between humans and especially other mammals can look like. And I think that's kind of where I've been. And maybe it's totally pessimistic, but that's where I've been. Thinking about the vulnerabilities that Corona highlights. And when I start to see certain animals, I'm like, that's, at least in that rural context, that's about more pressure on their lives and their kind of existences.
Because there's been a lot of research, if people aren't aware, pointing out that you know, the spread of viruses and mammal to human transmission is very likely to be caused, if not certainly caused, by deforestation and so on. So I think we'll probably share some links for these sorts of things afterwards for people if they want to have a look at that. How about for you, Lars? What's it been like out in Norway?
Right before Corona, I moved out in the countryside, not knowing that Corona would come. And then I just sort of found myself out here. I lived in Seoul for a year, and before that I lived in Berlin. And I sort of got very tired of that life, and yeah, I moved, and then suddenly Corona came, and I actually felt like I got quite ill. So I thought I had coronavirus pretty early on. So I was isolated in my house here. And after that, it's sort of been the same as always here. There's like one shop, there's two shops, and that's it. So I have a neighbor, and we interact. That's about it. I don't know much people out there. I just sort of live here. So I haven't, like, for me, it was very much a big change in my life in general before that. So it's very hard for me to sort of like compare to how it was before, because it was just so radically different. I didn't know, I mean, this is kind of far out, Norway. So people, you go to the shop and there's maybe 2 or 3 people there, or maybe 5. So it's not like Corona really changed that. And I would just go into the city once in a while. So then I would see the change, and then I actually traveled a bit to Berlin and stuff, and I saw how it was there. And yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to judge, sort of, because, I'm just out here, and I've just been trying to sort of deal with it. And clearly people around me were sort of like prone to they were in the risk zone, so I had to sort of be careful. And yeah, and as JT said, like, I also been thinking a lot about this topic and where it comes from, and sort of like how we can sort of go forward with this. And yeah, I mean, what I found most interesting was sort of like the way that people changed, but they changed in a way I didn't expect them to. Kind of like, it wasn't really like a wake-up call or anything as I see it. It's sort of like people are just sort of waiting for it to end. But I feel like the general conversation, at least in Norway, is not about this. It's sort of like, can I go to my summer house? Am I allowed to? It's like this kind of conversation. And I'm a bit sort of like, guys, you should wake up maybe, because this is not like, it's not about your summer house.
Do you think we can see the coronavirus as a sort of a direct warning of what's around the corner, in terms, obviously lots of places on the planet are being severely affected by climate change already, but this is a mass event which is sort of touching everybody. And I kind of thought maybe that will make people in sort of more privileged environments who aren't normally touched by these kind of natural disasters or heat freak weather events and so on. I thought it might make people pay more attention to the fact that we've got another bigger issue going on as well as coronavirus, which is global heating. Did you think that it might change people's perspectives of that? Any of you? Did you think that could have an impact?
To be really honest, I don't know. For example, Norway is like #1 in e-waste. I don't see that stopping with any of this. People are concerned, but it's more like a surface kind of thing. I don't really if some people should be concerned, it should be some of the richest nations in the world. They should be extremely concerned, because they're also like largely polluting. So I don't think that I want to see this as like a warning sign. I rather see it as a series of events, and it started way before this, and people weren't concerned. Like, people weren't concerned about all the deforestation that happens across the globe all the time. Like, even in Norway, this happens. Like, the amount of like forest and natural forest and so on has just been decreasing drastically. And like, you know, you can't keep going like this. It's just impossible. So people are not really caring, you know. And I don't think Corona really changed that much in terms of that.
I think, however, though, it brings to the fore, or it illustrates, or it somehow makes visible a lot of the same inequalities and the same impacts that we're looking at when we're looking at ecological destruction and climate change. Because, you know, with COVID, disproportionately, it's, you know, it's people of color, people with disabilities, people who are vulnerable, the poor and the working class, who are greatly impacted by this. And in the same way that you see a sort of exceptionalism when it comes to environmental loss amongst, you know, say wealthier nations or wealthier classes, you see very similar things in terms of, I mean, one of the things I keep coming up against here in the UK is this idea that it's okay, now they finally put in some kind of clampdown, which is like, if you really break the rules and you break your self-isolation, £10,000 fine, right? But it's like, what is a fine if not just like that's optional for those who can afford it? Do you know what I mean? And I think these things have a different kind of structural impact depending on who you are. And I think COVID makes visible that same parallel working that takes place in climate change.
I think that's why I found a lot of this narrative, which I kept seeing on Instagram and on some sort of nature writing accounts and things that I follow, which was people who kind of largely lived outside cities being quite pleased that they're like, oh, this is great. There's, you know, nature is healing became a meme that everybody took the piss out of in the end. But I could see it being said quite seriously. People were quite pleased people weren't in their particular green space out in the countryside, or that it seemed that animals were being more active and therefore this was a good thing. And that's what really sort of was at the heart of what made me feel really uncomfortable, is that how, you know, because it was generally white middle class people saying this in England, and I just felt that it sort of showed up a sort of quite a strong lack of awareness about exactly who gets impacted by things like COVID, and obviously will do with climate change and so on.
Yeah, it's a flattening of thinking, you know, it's like a complete lack of complexity in terms of thinking how these things impact a wide range of people and not just them.
Yeah.
And I feel like in the context of the US, it's come to the fore, the disposability of certain people. I mean, we're at it was like, I think for many people it's sort of, you know, in my timeline, that's not a study or anything, but people having a certain realization of the ways that as soon as the numbers started to drop about who was dying, and it was poor Black people in urban contexts and in rural contexts, that they simply were like, let's reopen everything, right? And so it really has brought to the fore that kind of disposability. And I think here it might be closer than we even want to, than maybe in the context of the European context, where these kinds of discussions lead directly to green fascism, right? Where they're like, you know, but also the demand, you know, the demands to reopen were all about having, you know, again, sacrificing certain class of people for convenience, like getting your hair cut. People are literally marching to get their hair cut, and marching to do all kinds of weird things, I guess, that they needed to do in this context. Again, so I think if we've been paying attention, at least in the United States context, people's worlds been ending every day in a way that like this is bringing to the fore as a possibility for us as a larger collective. I mean, again, Justin's work on Katrina. I mean, we could think about the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. We get caught up with this, the end of the world, especially in this country, culture apocalypse that is very unhelpful, because what it does is it obscures the ways that people's worlds end every day. If you lived in New Orleans during Katrina, your world ended, right? There's a way that, and we're witnessing the ways that that kind of disposability is nationalized and globalized, backwards. And I mean, out into communities outside of metropoles, and then back into the metropoles, and and this kind of ricochet. Yeah, and I think it also we have, of course, our political context. So with active deniers of both. So you can see there as well the kind of shared lack of, I don't know what, it's not a lack, it's actually a great antagonism. I don't want to describe that as a lack. They're, until they, in the last couple of days have been diagnosed, they've been trying to get rid of everybody who has it, writing people off as disabled and expendable. So I think it's brought to the fore in this context real limits and real scary tendencies that have been at the heart of how the U.S. operates, which are now at a real, at a really intense level. So,
bringing up these ideas of ecofascism and the far right and land, I think it strikes me in the same way as you've got your anti-vax, COVID conspiracy, QAnon seems to be attracting people from the right and the left, and people from kind of the mainstream to kind of alternative people. It seems to be all that sort of little cluster of that's very worrying seems to be attracting people from all over. It strikes me that sometimes racism and the far right and also the hard left and environmentalism are quite vulnerable to well, not vulnerable to it, but can use green issues for their own ends. There was a group in Britain called Patriotic Alternative who climbed up a hill and displayed a White Lives Matter banner. And I thought that's no coincidence. That was in the middle of lockdown. And they were using a hill that was actually where a big mass trespass happened in the early 20th century. That was a real defiant sort of assertion of working class ownership of land. So we've had that from the far right. The French Front National is starting to use a lot of get back to the land narrative with what they do. I still have massive alarm bells ring when the Extinction Rebellion founder called the Holocaust just another fuckery in human history. And I felt that belied a little, that there were people on the kind of environmental wing and in those groups, activist groups, who have some dubious views about overpopulation and so on. Are you all concerned about this, that it seems to be a sort of agglomeration of right and left activists, conservatives, maybe moving into green politics and green and the ecological sphere? Go ahead, anybody.
It's a big question. Yeah, I think this has been, it's one of those things that's been in the back of my mind, particularly in the work that, Luke, you and I are sort of in the same genre and the same field in the UK. It's in the back of my mind whenever I basically interact with anybody. And in the back of my mind, whenever I pick up any book, whenever I look at any book display, in the nature writing genre, whenever I go to any festival or any event that is, spuriously related to the environment in some way, right? Because there is always that moment when, particularly I found it, working with the Willowherb and working with the writers we work with, often we'll go into an event and you sense it. It's like we're cats and suddenly the hair stands up on the back of our necks. We're all sort of just looking around to make sure we're comfortable with the environment and with the crowd and with the language and the sort of theoretical framing of what we're talking about when we're doing an environmental or a nature themed event. And it could be just on the basis of like a lot of environmental hippie culture is like super culturally appropriative and very uncomfortable for a lot of people. There's that aspect. But then when it bleeds into like full on ecofascism, I think a lot of us are very attuned to it. And I think that's why, at least in my own work and in the work of many people I work closely with, I think we've in some ways really honed in on our communities and working with our communities and getting our voices and our stories down in whatever creative output that we can. Because frankly, I'm not all that interested in I don't know, going to an Extinction Rebellion march or whatever it is, right? Like I would rather actually just make sure that these voices that we're not hearing from get platformed, because to my mind, it's like, I don't want to give a lot more attention to eco-fascists or to organizations that, as you've said, like have sometimes problematic connections and backgrounds. I would rather devote all of that energy into supporting people who are making really great change, and to like literally putting money in the hands of writers of color, for example. That's where I would channel that energy.
Right. Yeah.
I don't even think we can talk about a kind of left perspective in this in the U.S. context. I mean, the kind of liberal, end of the Democratic Party has the kind of Green New Deal formulation, and I mean that hasn't gained any kind of steam officially, but like that's our kind of alternative, and it gives me great pause. I mean, just in the sense that the New Deal and its racial violences and exclusions are replicated, at least rhetorically, in that and unflinchingly in that. I mean, we know that the New Deal state was helped to reproduce racial capitalism, right? That it created tiers of laborers and all kinds of exclusions that we're still living with the effects of. And so that kind of, and it really relies on a notion of green consumption that doesn't challenge the kind of fundamental problem of where's the lithium coming from for these batteries? How are we building these new infrastructures without colonization of further land and territories and mines and forests? And so I think we're still in this country in a context where we have to explicitly denounce and even get on the table the denunciation of oil. And so I think it's hard. I mean, we're not in a place where, and I think there are tendencies that have emerged that I think populists in general that have what we might consider green fascist, kind of green fascism embedded within them, and notions that there are too many of certain kinds of people, and never Americans, or particularly white Americans, who consume an ungodly amount of hectares of resources every year. And so I think, but I'm also hopeful. I think there are folks in this context who have been doing really important work, and mainly from what I would say is kind of left, around land reform, around cooperative food processes. And I think this resonates with what Jessica said about how local communities are reimagining these kinds of relationships. I think those are, if we were to build infrastructures based on certain projects, let's say with Cooperation Jackson or other organizations, we were to build out from those, we really could have alternatives. So.
I wanted to ask about the Black Commons, JT. Is that something that connects to that, your work on the Black Commons, and is that to do with sort of the ideas of land ownership and cooperative ownership of land and community ownership?
Certainly, I think if given full expression, the Black Commons as a kind of vision would have articulated out from slavery forward a whole reimagining of landscapes that were registered as a kind of liberation, a quest for liberation, but which could also, we might consider, would have had been more sustainable in terms of long-term development and sort of overall well-being. For me, the Black Commons is a kind of fleeting process and spatial outlook that emerges in the context of plantations when basically through what I call what I think about as the plot. The plot being foremost the site of burial the internment of an individual, of enslaved people's ancestors, elders, that ties them and binds them to a certain landscapes, even if as those remain unmarked. Secondly, the plot, but also in that emphasizing the ways that sites of death, which was all about environmental catastrophe in that context of forest clearing, all of that, that helps to drive malaria, helps to create the conditions of starvation and smallpox, et cetera. And then, and the second version, the second sort of motion of the plot is the parcel of land, right? This space that planters give to enslaved people as basically a downloading of responsibility for feeding them. But is where Black communities reproduce a certain kind of use value around the land that's not about commodity, the land as commodity. That gives vision to these other kinds of iterations of the plot, one of which is like a roving imagination of what the landscape could be, that you can catch in the kind of fleeting ways that enslaved and post-emancipation communities use fishing and engage with each other in commensality and all of these other modes that I think it's really important for us to read as for their environmental content. I think that moves forward, in the context of Black urban communities as well. Plotting doesn't just end, neither does the Civil War or the formal end of slavery disrupt that. This roving imagination of a commons is an enduring one. And it's criminalized, it's considered, theft, it's considered all kinds of other things, and yet it's, I do think that it's ongoing, and it articulates other visions, very, very different visions, more robust, I think, visions of sustainability than ultimately than green consumption.
Hey, great. Thank you very much. That was very well put. I thought it was interesting, actually. I did some research on Detroit and what's happening in the inner city there. And there was a lot of African-American organizations kind of taking plots where there used to be houses and doing community gardens and growing and, some plans to kind of grow biofuels, which, controversial themselves, but, sort of, there's an organization called Greening of Detroit that was sort of seemed to be very community-led. Do you think that's a sort of a future that can apply in different contexts, maybe outside of America as well? Maybe Lars, maybe there's sort of in Norway. Do you think there's ways that people can have a more sort of holistic relationship with the land and sustainability? Is there a space for it?
I think there's a difference between, for example, the US and Norway in terms of like what's public. We have a lot of public forest and land in Norway, and it's quite heavily regulated, which is a good thing. But at the same time, it's less and less, like there's more and more sort of like land turned into agroforestry and so on, but it's not really sustainable agroforestry. So it's not and farming is pretty old school, and like the last 20, 30 years, main farming that has been supported has been farming of large scale farming and not so much small scale farming, and that has sort of created like similar scenarios. I think in for example Germany it's way worse, but like in Norway it's still a problem that you get like large farms that just do one thing, and there's not like a holistic thinking around that and smaller farms are just not possible to economically run, which is a general problem, I think, is even in the US. And you just can't like economically you can't compete, and there's little push from the government to support more sustainable farming in general. So of course you have all this sort of like urban farming and all this like green initiatives, which are good. They create community and so on, which is great. But at the same time, like they don't really turn around one of the biggest issues we have, which is like we need to change the way we, first of all, Norwegians need to change their diet, because their diet like resembles something like a Central European diet, and it should resemble closer to something that we could be more self-reliant. We have like something like 30% degree of self-reliance or something in Norway, which is extremely low compared to what we can have. But it's a lot of it is diet, and a lot of it is sort of like the way we produce the food. And so in that term, and I think like Norway, for example, should definitely change a lot, because we have both the capital to do so, and we actually also have the moral. We should morally be very engaged in changing this, because we are one of the biggest consumers in many ways. So there's lots of sort of issues in terms of that, and very sort of old thinking in ways of how you do this. And also it's a largely economical question, because EU is always pushing on our door and trying to like export as much as they can into Norway. And that makes it impossible to be a farmer almost in Norway. So, yeah.
If we're thinking about sort of trying to be more sustainable, focusing on the local and on our communities, how do we manage, and thinking about place and who owns land and so on, how do we then sort of, I mean, maybe this is a very UK centric thing, but how do we then divorce that from toxic nationalism and the ideas that in Britain urban areas are generally increasingly multicultural, rural areas are very much not multicultural, and if we start talking about localism, then that gets connected to proud British farmers, and then suddenly you're in Brexit, and then suddenly you've got the racist elements of that, and you sort of suddenly it can all feel very insurmountable. So how do we sort of generate an idea of a connection to place and a connection and love of green space, that we can sort of get rid of the toxic parts, which is, this is my land, my people are from here, and then suddenly you're into blood and soil and it's all gone horrible. How do we do that? Is that something that art can help us with, do you think?
Well, I think, to tackle that question, it means sort of reframing the content of what that my land and what that nationalism looks like. If you want to talk about proud British, British anything, proud British anything, what you're talking about is the legacy of colonialism. And until we reckon with that, there's no point in having a conversation. You know what I mean? Like, it's like any conversation around environment, around climate justice, around the idea of the local, and how that interacts with the idea of the multicultural, needs to acknowledge the fact that the entire sort of nationalist ideal is built on that legacy. It's one of the things that comes up really often in conversations I have with people, is this idea that, we really like to eat locally. We really like to live sustainably in terms of what that means, where we are here. I'm in the UK now. But I also have, I come from a family with a long migration history. And in order to see my family, for example, I have to travel. In order to eat the foods I grew up eating, all of these things are much more complicated than just saying, there's like a one size fits all solution for what it looks like to be sustainable for each community. So, we need more people at the table having that conversation, but we also need we need people to actually acknowledge history in that conversation, and actually like see the way that history is not history. It's not in the past. It continues to have workings in terms of structural inequality and injustice today.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think, JT, your essay about Tidewater, Virginia, that's on the Transformation Narratives website, maybe I think Unsound might have the link, we can share it. I thought that was a very, very powerful piece of writing in terms of the connection to place and the people who use it. And even, you're talking about how the Black community will use the different dirt roads, because the main roads there's the risk of police harassment and so on, and encountering racist other road users, but then the back roads have their own dangers. And I just wanted to talk about, I find that fascinating, that connection to a sort of presumably quite rural part of America, and how you see that that sort of black rural identity changing over in the coming years, and its impact that it might have on wider issues in America and American environmentalism and so on? If that's not too gigantic a question for you, sorry. But it's a great piece, and people should read that article. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I appreciate your engagement. I think we have lots of political legacies that we can draw on in trying to articulate new visions of the world. Some of them were violently assassinated because they, we can think about Sankara and other people, that there's a new and exciting work around their efforts to change food systems, to change land tenure systems. So there, and I wanted to highlight as well Huey Newton's, his kind of turn towards what he considered revolutionary intercommunalism in relation to this question of nationalism. He says that in the 70s, he's a very prescient theorist of globalization, although he doesn't call it that. And as part of the Black Panther Party, one of their kind of change from nationalism to revolutionary nationalism to revolutionary intercommunalism, it really hinged on the question of how do we reimagine communities not as sites of global extraction that make the few wealthy, and which destroy the kinds of ecologies and social fabrics of rural and urban communities. But he says as well that the kind of technologies that allow the world to be connected in these new ways that start emerging under globalization also bear the possibilities for other types of connection. And I see this conversation and other kinds of conversations, even as they're forged through lithium batteries and other kinds of, as bearing the kind of possibilities for alternative futures. And I think that's heightened for me in the context of rural Black America. Had we listened to rural Black communities in this country post-emancipation or at various other moments about their visions for the land and its and a move away from certain kinds of ownership and all of that we'd already be in a different situation. Let me ground that. Fannie Lou Hamer, by the early 1970s, is calling for land reform. A famous civil rights leader in the context of Mississippi is calling for land reform, as Monica White's work points to. That includes a pig bank, that includes these kind of mutual aid organizations that feed each other. I think we can draw on Black rural life and the kinds of organic ways that these communities have been engaged in mutual aid and possibility and feeding one another as ways forward that get towards what Newton considered revolutionary intercommunalism. Like, how do we, if we can, and I think that's why we have to center ecologies as narratives about humans, not to say that there aren't other interspecies connections and other, I'm not saying that humans should be at the center to reiterate or underscore a new, anthropocentric discourses, but rather I think that's where the real annealing work has to happen. If we're not exploiting each other, we're not exploiting the forest in the same ways. If we're not exploiting each other, we might come to an appreciation as oil as part of our the kind of ancestral residue in the earth of all life, rather than something that we can just pump and burn. So I think we have to, and I think there's no other people, indigenous people, Black communities, all kinds of people around the world have been living these lives. They never had the same kind of access to oil and computers and all of that. And I think we should take the worldviews and outlooks and epistemologies and practices of those people very seriously. Again, that's to underscore what Jessica said. Different people got to be at the table for us to talk about sustainability and what it should and could look like beyond, again, consumption, more consumption.
That's great, thank you. I love the idea of the oil as this sort of collective residue of life that we leave behind us. I think that's a really powerful image. Thank you. Lars, is that something that was almost an optimistic message from JT there. Do you feel that you can see that see that yourself? Do you have an optimistic outlook that we can learn from these different groups and, try and find a way forward and learn from our histories?
Yeah, I agree with JT actually. I mean, I think land ownership, what ownership means, I mean, if it's communal or so on, I do think that's like a big issue, especially in the US but also in Norway. I mean, like if you want to start, for example, another kind of farming or any sort of alternative to the current sort of industrial farming, your chance of succeeding is quite low, and even your entry into farming is becoming harder and harder. So I think that's one part. And then, of course, there's this, we have to say goodbye to oil. I mean, Norway should be the first one to do that. That's obvious. But we should also say goodbye to farmed salmon in the sea, for example. We should say goodbye to a lot of things here. And actually, there's a farmed fish farms all around my area where they produce the salmon and other kinds of fish for export. And it's big business here, but it ruins the fjords and the ecosystem in general. So yeah, there's lots of these kind of problems of sort of exploitation that doesn't really benefit the public, because some of the richest people in Norway, they came from salmon. And that should not be the question. They should be publicly, if they want to run them in the sea, which I think is a bad idea, they should be on land. They should be publicly owned, and they should not be turning some people into the richest people. You just create more differences. And that's a tendency in Norway, actually, even with COVID, has also shown the differences in Norway. Of course, the differences in Norway is we have a lot of social welfare and so on to try to take care of that, but there's still differences. And the problem of this, I think, is like as soon as you start to, there's the shift from turning what should be publicly owned goods into private hands in terms of like natural resources, so on, you get these problems of basically turning some people into really rich people, and that should not be happening. So yeah, we still have quite some publicly owned. Like, an interesting fact is that my electricity is run on a cooperative, so I get my energy from a local cooperative here, and there's no stock owners or anything of my electricity, and the funding goes back into the community.
Wow.
And these models are possible, but of course I would also say it's a privilege, so you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. But these could be models for other ways of doing things, like, in terms of like how you could localize different parts of your infrastructure to create a feedback loop, instead of just like siphoning it all off until some, so there's hope. I think there's hope, and I think the global aspect, what JT mentions in terms of technology, it could be sharing different models and sharing different ways of working in infrastructure that could be applied in different ways, different aspects in different aspects of your life, and also in different areas of the world. And I think could be an exchange there in terms of like methods. So I'm a bit positive, but I'm I'm skeptical, because living in Norway is you kind of have to face this every day,
Okay. Unsound, do we have any questions from the people watching? If you want to message, let us know. I think it's interesting looking at, these things are sort of age old, aren't they? In that, in Britain, I think 0.3% of the population own 2/3 of the land, which is just a ridiculous statistic, really, of how unequal it is. And most of those aren't sort of corporations necessarily. There are a lot of very old aristocratic families, like the Queen, who took ownership of land through enclosure and turning land into sheep farming and displacing the inhabitants, white British, but they were there for a long time. They had communities, they worked in commons, and they were displaced from the land in exchange for wool farming, and wool was what the British empire was built on, after all. So I think you can see all these things sort of stretching back into history. And like you were saying, Jessica, I think, British colonialism also had a gigantic ecological class impact on Britain itself. And maybe that's a narrative we need to start telling people, that, colonialism isn't just white Britain versus everybody else and so on. It's, colonialism caused environmental destruction and displacement and inequality here as well. And we can then feel solidarity with people who are the victims of colonialism around the world too. Maybe that's a way of having these conversations to kind of get people engaged through their familiar landscapes in places like Britain.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, it's just asking people always to hold complexity at the heart of these conversations, I think is one of the big challenges, because, when we speak about the sort of ideal of Britain, when we're talking about the British Empire, I mean, that is something that was constructed and sculpted and crafted in that exercise of colonialism, and in that exercise of traveling abroad and exchanging things back and forth. And one of the things I always come back to is the idea that it's not just like a one-way extractive process, right? Like there were complex modes of interaction and of shaping of landscape ideals, of what we imagine a pristine nature to be, of what we imagine, natural beauty to be, and that those were shaped in that exchange back and forth. It's one of the things that I always come back to is it Alfred Crosby's Ecological Imperialism, this idea that it was not simply that things were extracted from colonized places, but also that things were brought, and colonized places were in some sense also shaped and reshaped in the ideal of home, of a British home in the distance, right? So these things they're very complex. And this is where I really do think it's about having these conversations with as many people as possible at the table, and without everyone getting a bit, I guess, getting their hackles up about having to talk about difficult histories. I think it's really important.
To say real quick on that point, Jessica, I mean, Virginia, when I think about the ecological environment, the reason I focus on there, it in part is its home, but also because it's the kind of, in, at least in a kind of Anglo North American sense, a kind of origin site. And if we take it at that word of itself, it basically, they basically recreated the 18th century UK landscape here, right? And replicated it. I mean, you could follow Virginians' colonization to East Texas, into the 20th century. You could see where Virginians had colonized with slavery and the kinds of infrastructures that they built, the kinds of houses that they built, and the ways that model is replicated over and over with great effect.
I grew up in a town called London in Canada, and it has like all the same street names, and every single detail, it has a Thames River, like all these little details where it just, how do I put it? It shows, I think, how much of that movement was not in one direction, right? It's yeah.
Definitely. And I think that's part of trying to remake these kinds of landscapes is, as you pointed to, really about assessing the reality in the ways that the histories are ongoing and that they live. And we really have to deal with the kind of consequences of those. And I think, at the same time that we confront our sort of ongoing dependence on oil and kind of extractivism globally, we have to think about how our imaginations of the good life came through these kind of violent genocidal and enslaving histories.
We've got a quick question from Katie Hasker, who's tuned in, I think, on YouTube. And JT, you mentioned mutual aid, and Katie wonders if there's been a lot of mutual aid groups setting up during lockdown and under COVID in lots of people's local areas. Do you think that this could be a way, something that then it gets extrapolated into, I guess, thinking about ecology and food creation and so on? Do you think that could be a positive that comes out of what people have had to do due to this situation?
Certainly. Again, I think there are lots. I'm thinking about the kind of context of Black political organizing in rural and urban communities here between Raleigh, North Carolina. There's an organization that's emerged to make sure that people have food in a context in which a grocery store, even amid COVID, is closed, right? Creating a bigger food desert. Similarly in Jackson and other places. I think it's, that work has been going on, it's been necessary. I don't think, COVID era depression is not something that Black communities in rural and urban US contexts didn't already know about. Social and economic isolation, a kind of enforced stillness, policing. We can think about all of the kinds of ways that this is the everyday. So yeah, I think those are the models for what we can do forward. Up through collectives and cooperatives and other modes of coming together and producing things and circulating things and all of that are not tied to violent extractionism that's lodged out there over there somewhere. I think too, I was gonna say this earlier, I think to Jessica, your point, we also have to be critical of the ways that our imaginaries about conservation are shaped in imperialism, right? That was about forest management. Conservation as we inherited, at least in the US context, was about making sure that there's a forest for us to exploit forever, right? And so it's definitely about an ongoing, that conservationism is tied to ongoing colonialism, not to a radical rupture in that. And again, I think in all those kinds of contexts, there have been what we might call mutual aid, cooperative living, other visions outside of exploitation around, like through mutuality or some other kind of non-violent relationship that we can draw forward, that we can historicize, that we can bring to the fore, that we can create new stories out of, that we must. I don't think we have options. So.
Thank you. One more question from Jakob Teres, who says, thanks everyone for an amazing discussion. And they want to know, given that politicians and big corporations seem quite intractable, and none of our leaders are particularly heading in the right direction, do you think it's possible to make change and for a kind of wider environmental centered thinking to take root when you've got the obstacles of power firmly in the way? I suppose that's the ultimate "are you optimistic?" question, really.
Can I just say, I think we have really good reason to be optimistic about a widespread sense of concern and care. I think if you speak to young people today, there's a lot to be optimistic about. If you look at the change, I don't think I'd be able to do my job if I didn't maintain some sense of optimism. But I would just say, and I think this is built into the question, we have to resist at every step of the way the, I would say, very capitalist idea that this is up to us as individuals. It's, this is not on any one of us as individuals. This is a collective thing. And it is, as you say, it's about structures and it's about power.
Anybody else want to? I think we slightly kind of answered that one. And I think from my perspective, there are these small engagements, I think, that are really important. And if I'm going back to the start of where we began, if I'm looking at the landscape around me and Epping Forest, which I've written about a lot and wrote my book about, and noticing the demographics of who used Epping Forest over this lockdown has been very, very different. When I've been going up there, the community around that bit of urban woodland is very mixed. The people using the forest were generally older white people walking their dogs. That's kind of the core user base. But over the course of lockdown going there, I've seen a lot more representation of different communities who live around the forest in there, and the start of kind of seem to be mutual solidarity groups, you know, for people of color going into nature. As I write about in the Unsound essay, you're far more likely to get stopped by police in rural areas as a person of color than a white person, to a ridiculous proportion. And now there's a group called Flock Together World, which is a bird watching group for people of color to go around London area bird watching in a big group. And I think these are these small things that probably will then hopefully build and cause bigger changes down the line. I think, like you're saying, Jessica, it's not individual action is useful, and you know, your individual writers make a big difference. I think, you know, I think some of the writing you've been doing is incredibly important in Willowherb, but collectively then that's going to have a greater impact in changing minds and changing experiences. So has anybody got any final points they want to bring up or make? 'Cause I think we're probably just about out of time. So yeah, okay, let's wrap things up. I think there's more discussion going to be going on the Discord, Unsound Discord page, which I'm looking at now. It's even got a ballroom. People who know about Unsound will know the ballroom is a highlight of Unsound, but I'm not quite sure whether it's going to be quite the same on the internet. But yeah, join in there if you want to. And I'd just like to thank Jessica, JT and Lars for joining us. Do look up Willowherb Review. Lars, what's the best way for people to keep track of what you're doing? Is it via TCF or the Biota newsletter?
I can post a link to it and you can sign up if you want
Yeah.
to, so it's possible.
Cool. And JT, your work with Black Ecologies, how can people keep up with what you're doing over there?
The Institute for Humanities Research at ASU has a Black Ecologies Initiative page that folks can check out. Or also I'm on Twitter and I tweet a lot about these things. So.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for taking part. Thanks, everyone who's been watching on the other end of the wire and the lithium batteries. And thanks very much to Unsound Festival for having us all. And I hope everyone has a good evening. Thank you. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.